She had 38 years of calluses, a dead crop, a sick mother-in-law, and 45 days before the most powerful land baron in Texas took everything she had ever bled for. The bank sent a man to collect the debt, but the man who showed up, a cold, wealthy cattle baron who came to claim her water, did something nobody expected. He put the deed back in his pocket, and what happened next would change both of their lives forever. This is not a story about a woman being rescued. This is a story about a woman who fought a corrupt judge with a piece of paper her father wrote 20 years before she needed it, and won. A story about what it truly means to choose someone, not because you need them to survive, but because you are finally strong enough to stand on your own. If that's the kind of story that moves you, hit the like button right now, leave a comment, share it with someone who deserves to hear it, and subscribe, because we tell stories like this one every single week.
The Texas dirt never apologized to anyone, and that morning in the blistering August of 1878, it told Josie Mercer a hard truth. It was about to take the last of what she had. Josie stood in the middle of the ruined wheat. The stalks were brittle, yellowed like old bones. She wore her late husband's faded work shirt. It hung loose on her shoulders. She looked down at her hands, 38 years old, knuckles split, calluses as thick as boot leather, dirt packed deep beneath the nails. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in 2 years. Tears were just wasted water. Dust kicked up on the horizon. A buggy rolling down the trail. It was Mr. Finch, the man from the bank. He stepped down, wiping his red neck with a handkerchief. He didn't look at the dead crops. He didn't look at her face. He just looked at the papers in his hand. $2,100, Mrs. Mercer, Finch said. His voice was flat. Josie wiped her brow. The heat was suffocating. She knew what this was really about. Thaddeus Cornwall, the richest land baron in the Panhandle. Cornwall didn't want a dead wheat farm. He wanted what was underneath it. The deep-water aquifer, the only reliable water source for 20 miles. He had been starving out the small ranches one by one. I don't have the money, Josie said. Her voice didn't shake. The drought took the crop, but I have the water, and I have 2 working hands. Hands don't pay the bank, ma'am, Finch muttered. Cornwall is willing to buy the note. You have 44 days. They'll pay the debt, or the sheriff changes the locks. Josie stepped closer. She didn't shrink. She did big. A piece of paper doesn't erase 16 years of sweat, Mr. Finch, Josie said, her voice cutting straight through the dry wind. Josie said, you tell Cornwall that a woman's labor is worth just as much as any man's signature. I built this place alongside I bleed for it. I am not leaving. Finch swallowed hard. He tipped his hat, climbed back into his buggy, and rode off. Josie stood alone. The silence of the plains was deafening. Afternoon came. Still, unforgiving, Josie was in the yard. The heavy oak wheel of the freight wagon had splintered. She had it propped on a wooden block. She was wrestling the heavy iron rim back into place. Grease stained her cheek. Her muscles burned. She heard the horse before she saw it. A massive black stallion stepped into the yard. Josie paused. She picked up a heavy iron wrench, just in case. The rider swung down from the saddle. Silas Vance, 44 years old, owner of the Double H. He didn't look like a rich cattle baron. He looked like the trail, faded denim, dust-caked boots, eyes like chipped flints. Silas had an envelope in his coat pocket. Inside was the deed to the Mercer farm. He hadn't come to save her. He was a businessman. His 800 head of cattle were dying of thirst. He had walked into the bank that morning and bought Arthur's debt right out from under Cornwall. Silas came to claim the debt. He came to take the water rights. He reached inside his coat. His fingers touched the thick paper. Then he stopped. He looked at Josie. She was panting. Her shirt was soaked with sweat. She held the heavy wrench, her chin tipped up, eyes daring him to cross the line. She looked like a woman who had fought the devil all morning and was ready for a second round. Silas' hand slowly slipped out of his pocket, empty. He didn't see a helpless widow. He didn't see a victim. He saw the cracked skin on her hands. He saw the sheer, unbending will holding her upright. He walked toward her. Josie tightened her grip on the wrench. Silas didn't speak. He didn't offer a patronizing smile. He just stepped to the other side of the broken wagon wheel. He planted his boots in the dirt. He reached down and took hold of the iron rim. He didn't take it from her. He didn't push her out of the way to do it himself. He waited. He waited for her to lift. Josie stared at him. Then she pulled. Silas pulled with her. The heavy iron rim slid perfectly into place. Much obliged, Josie breathed out, wiping the grease from her forehead. Silas nodded. Just once, he left the deed right where, deep in his pocket. He realized in that quiet moment that you don't collect a debt from a woman who has already paid for her life, blood and bone. You stand beside her. He tipped his hat, turned around, and walked back to his horse. Josie watched him ride away. The wind picked up, cool for just a second. She knew he would be back, and for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't afraid. Silas Vance didn't believe in charity. Charity made people soft. It made them wait for a hand down instead of finding a way up. Silas believed in dirt. He believed in sweat. He believed in the cold, hard numbers written in the ranch ledgers. He rode back to the Double H in the dark. The black stallion took the miles easy. Silas did. His mind was loud. He reached into his coat. The thick paper of the deed brushed against his knuckles. The Mercer farm, 200 acres of cracked earth, and right beneath it a deep-water aquifer, salvation for his dying herd. He had bought the debt from the cattleman's bank 2 days ago. He paid in gold. He didn't do it to save Arthur, Mercer's widow. He did it to beat Thaddeus Cornwall to the water. It was a business calculation, cold, simple. But the woman holding that iron wrench wasn't a calculation. Silas walked into his ranch house. It was massive stone and timber, but it was empty. It had been empty for 4 years. He lit a kerosene lamp on his heavy oak desk. He sat down. He poured a finger of rice whiskey into a glass but didn't drink it. He stared at the deed in the yellow light. He thought about his wife, Sarah. She had died of typhoid fever while he was driving cattle up to Kansas. He had been away chasing money, chasing land. By the time he rode back, the dirt over her grave was already settled. That was the day Silas closed the door to his chest. He locked it from the inside. He told himself that land didn't die on you. Cows didn't break your heart. Only people did. He looked at the deed again. He had ridden out to the Mercer place to hand the widow an ultimatum: leave in a week or leave in handcuffs. But then he saw her. Josie Mercer. She wasn't crying over a broken wheel. She wasn't waiting for a man to ride by and fix it. She was covered in grease, sweating, lifting the iron rim with her own bleeding hands. She looked like a woman holding up the sky, refusing to let it fall. Silas opened his ledger. He picked up his fountain pen. He could foreclose tomorrow. The law was on his side. But taking a farm from a woman fighting that hard, that wasn't business. That was theft. It was stealing a person's dignity. Silas dipped the pen in ink. He began to write on a fresh sheet of paper. He didn't write a pardon. He didn't forgive the debt. Giving her a free pass would insult. It would mean he looked at her and saw a helpless creature. She wasn't helpless. She was a worker. He wrote a contract. The next morning the sun broke angry and red over the plains. Silas saddled his horse. He rode back to the Mercer farm. Josie was already in the yard. She was chopping firewood. The axe fell in a steady, brutal rhythm. Thwack, thwack. Silas stopped his horse. He dismounted. He walked to the woodpile. Josie paused. She leaned on the axe handle. She didn't look surprised to see him. She just looked tired, but her eyes were sharp. Silas pulled the folded paper from his pocket. He held it out. I came here yesterday to take your land, Mrs. Mercer, Silas said. His voice was gravelly low. That's the truth. I bought your husband's debt. I need your water for my cows. Josie didn't flinch. She looked at the paper. And today is different. Silas looked her dead in the eye. I think a woman who can replace a broken wagon axle with her bare hands deserves a chance to buy back her life. Nobody gave me anything for free. I won't insult you by doing it either. I need labor. You need money. We trade sweat for freedom. He didn't hand the paper to her like a gift. He held it out like a business partner. Josie slowly let go of the axe. She wiped her hands on her jeans. She took the paper. She unfolded it. Her eyes scanned the ink. Silas watched her. He saw the intelligence in her gaze. She wasn't just looking at the words. She was reading the math. You want me to work at the Double H, she said softly. 4 days a week. Silas nodded. The debt gets docked for every hour you put in. You keep your farm. You keep your water. You pay me back in labor. Josie looked up from the paper. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. I'll think on it, she said. Silas nodded. I'll be in my office tomorrow morning. If you don't show, I send the sheriff. He turned and walked away. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what she was going to do because Silas knew the value of hard work. But more importantly, he had just the value of the woman doing it. Josie didn't wear her Sunday best. You don't wear lace to a gunfight, and you don't wear a dress to a business negotiation. She wore her heavy leather work boots. She wore Arthur's old canvas coat. She rode into the Double H ranch just after dawn. The air was crisp. The place was massive. Miles of whitewashed fences. Giant red barns, a bunkhouse that looked bigger than the tall. A few ranch hands stopped what they were doing. They stared. Women didn't ride into the Double HS alone, especially not widows wearing men's coats. Josie ignored them. She tied her horse to the hitchings, walked up the wooden steps. Her boots hit the porch with a heavy, steady sound. The front door was open. Silas sat behind a massive oak desk. Standing near the wall was an older man, gray beard, weathered face. Elias Thorne, the ranch foreman. Elias looked at Josie with narrowed eyes, assessing her. Josie walked in. She didn't wait to be offered a chair. She stood in front of the desk. She placed the folded contract down on the wood. I read your terms, Mr. Vance, Josie said. Her voice was steady. Silas leaned back in his leather chair. And The hours are fine. 4 days a week, sun up to sundown. I can do that. Josie placed her hands flat on the desk. She leaned in, but your math is wrong. Elias snorted from the corner. Ma'am, Mr. Vance doesn't get his math wrong. Josie didn't look at Elias. She kept her eyes locked on Silas. He did this time. Silas didn't get angry. He looked curious. Enlighten me, Mrs. Mercer. You put me down for 80 cents a day, Josie said. That S a boy's wage. That S what you pay a greenhorn to muck out the stalls. You're a woman, Elias chimed in. 80 cents is generous. Josie finally turned her head. She looked at Elias. The foreman stopped talking. There was a quiet fire in her eyes that made men step back. She turned back to Silas. I am not selling my dignity, Mr. Vance, Josie said. Each word was a hammer striking an anvil. I am selling my labor. I know how to mend a barbed wire fence. I know how to pull a calf. I know how to drive a herd. If I do a man's work, you pay me a man's wage. Silas stared at her. The room went dead silent. I have a 14-year-old daughter, Josie continued. Her voice dropped, losing the anger, replacing it with raw iron. I have a mother-in-law with lungs full of fluid. I carry the weight of that farm alone. I will not break my back for pennies just because society says a woman is worth less than a man. $1.50 a day. No discount because I wear a skirt. Or I walk out that door and let Cornwall take the land. It was a bluff. She had nowhere else to go. But she delivered it like she held 4 aces. Silas looked at her hands. The knuckles were bruised. The calluses were thick. Those were not the hands of a woman who quit. Those were the hands of a survivor. Silas reached into his desk drawer. He pulled out his fountain pen. He didn't argue. He didn't try to talk her down to $1. He scratched out the 80 cents on the paper. He wrote in a bold, dark hand. He turned the paper around. He pushed it across the desk toward her. Sign it, Silas said. Josie looked at the number. A knot in her chest finally loosened, but she didn't let it show on her face. She picked up the pen. She signed her name, Josephine Mercer. Silas stood up. He didn't offer her a polite bow. He didn't tip his hat. He extended his right hand. Josie looked at it. She reached out. Their hands met over the oak desk. His hand was warm, rough like sandpaper, was just tough. It was a grip between equals. No pity, no charity, just an understanding. You report to Elias tomorrow at dawn, Silas said. Bring heavy gloves. We're fixing the west boundary line. I have my own gloves, Josie said. She let go of his hand.
She picked up her copy of the contract.
She folded it, slipped it into her coat. She turned and walked out of the office. Elias watched her go. He listened to her boots hit the porch steps. Then the dirt. He turned to Silas.
Boss,
Elias said, slowly.
She's a widow. She ain't gonna last 2 days out on the west boundary. That ground is pure rock.
Silas sat back down. He looked at the ink drying on his copy of the contract. You're wrong, Elias, Silas said quietly. She's going to outwork half the men in your bunkhouse. Why do you say that? Because a man works for his paycheck, Silas said, looking out the window toward the dust trail Josie was leaving behind. A mother works for her family's survival. Never bet against a woman who has nothing left to lose. Elias scratched his beard. He didn't say anything else. Silas poured the whiskey he had left out the night before back into the bottle. He didn't need a drink today. He felt something else in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in a long, long time, respect. The west boundary of the Double H Ranch was nothing but hard pan and limestone. It was the kind of earth that broke tools, and the men who swung them dawn broke over the prairie, painting the sky a bruised purple. Josie stood at the edge of the property line. She held a 60-pound iron digging bar. Elias Thorne sat on his horse a few yards away. He was drinking coffee from a tin cup. He didn't say a word. He was waiting for her to quit. Josie raised the iron bar. She brought it down, clang. The iron hit the rock below the topsoil. The vibration shot up her arm. It rattled her teeth. She gritted her jaw, lifted the bar, and drove it down again and again. By mid-morning, the Texas sun was a physical weight on her shoulders. Her canvas coat was tied around her waist. Her shirt clung to her back. Her hands, even inside her leather gloves, wore new blisters under the old ones. She had dug 3 post holes. The men down the line had dug 5, but the men were working in pairs. Josie was working alone. She hit a buried limestone boulder. The digging bar bounced off. She dropped to her knees in the dirt. She grabbed a wooden pry bar. She wedged it under the rock. She pushed. The rock didn't move. She adjusted her grip. She threw her entire body weight against the wood. Her boots slipped in the loose dust. The rock shifted an inch, then settled back into the earth. Hoofbeats approached, slow, steady. Josie didn't look up. She wiped the sweat from her eyes and reset the pry bar. Silas Vance pulled his black stallion to a halt. He looked down at her. He looked at the hole. He looked at the massive slab of white limestone wedged in the dirt. Most men would have stepped in. Most men would have told her to step aside. They would have grabbed the bar, puffed out their chests, and done the heavy lifting. They would have called it chivalry. Silas didn't do that. He swung down from the saddle. He didn't say a word. He walked over to the hole. He didn't reach for her pry bar. Instead, he grabbed the heavy iron digging bar she had left in the dirt. He stepped into the hole beside her. He wedged the iron point under the opposite side of the rock. He looked at her. "On three," Silas said. Josie looked at him. The respect in his eyes was quiet, but it was solid, like the ground they were standing on. He wasn't rescuing her. He was partnering with her, Josie said. "Two," Silas answered. "Three." They pulled together. The combined leverage of the wood and the iron bit into the earth. The limestone groaned. Silas didn't overpower her side. He matched her rhythm. With a heavy sucking sound, the boulder tore free from the soil and rolled out onto the grass. Josie let out a long breath. She leaned on her wooden pole. Silas pulled his iron bar out of the dirt. He didn't smile. He didn't ask if she was all right. He knew she was. "Good leverage," Silas said. "Good timing," Josie replied. Silas nodded. He walked back to his horse, climbed into the saddle, and rode down the fence line to check on the rest of the crew. Elias Thorne had watched the whole thing from his horse. He trotted over to Josie. He looked at the rock. Then he looked at the 3 deep, perfectly straight post holes she had dug. Elias reached up and tipped his hat to her. Just an inch. It was a small gesture, but out west, a foreman's nod was worth its weight in gold. Josie picked up her digging bar. She moved 3 paces down the line. She raised the iron and brought it down again. By the end of the second week, the blistered skin on Josie's hands had hardened into thick, permanent calluses. She had found a rhythm: 4 days at the Double H, 3 days at her own farm, tending to Martha, making sure Abby was keeping up with her schoolwork. She was exhausted, a deep bone-weary exhaustion that made her sleep like the dead. But her mind was quiet. The constant gnawing fear of the bank taking her home was fading. She was earning her way out. It was a Tuesday, high noon, lunchtime on the range. The chuck wagon was parked under a cluster of cottonwood trees. The ranch hands sat in a wide circle. They ate beans, salted beef, and biscuits. They laughed. They told loud stories. Josie didn't sit with them. She took her tin plate and walked over to the wooden corral fence. She sat on the bottom rail in the shade. She liked the quiet. She knew the men respected her work, but she was still a woman in a man's world. Her presence changed the way they talked. She gave them their space, and they gave her hers. She was halfway through her biscuit when boots crunched in the dry grass. Silas walked over. He carried a tin plate in one hand and 2 steaming tin cups of coffee in the other. He didn't ask if the seat was taken. He just sat down on the dirt next to the fence a few feet away from her. He set one of the coffee cups on the flat rail beside her knee. "Cookie makes it thick enough to patch a roof," Silas said, staring out at the herd. "Just how I like it," Josie said. She picked up the cup. The heat felt good against her calloused palms. They ate in silence. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was the kind of quiet that only happens between 2 people who know the value of hard work. "Elias tells me you spotted a sick calf yesterday," Silas said eventually, before the mother even started kicking. "Calf was walking with its head too low," Josie said. "Ears were drooping. Same thing happened to a calf Arthur and I had 5 years ago. Tick fever. You caught it early. Saved me a good $50 at market." "I'm just doing the job, Mr. Vance." Silas turned his head and looked at her. "Silas." Josie paused, her coffee cup halfway to her mouth. He looked at him. "We've moved enough rocks together, Mrs. Mercer," he said. "I think we can drop the formalities." Josie took a slow sip of the bitter coffee. "Josie, my name is Josie," Silas nodded. "Josie." He said her name like it had weight, like it mattered. True respect isn't built with grand speeches. It isn't built by a man laying his coat over a puddle. True respect is built in the dirt. It's built in the silent acknowledgement of shared burdens. It is built when a man looks at a woman and doesn't see a fragile thing to be protected, but a capable force to be reckoned with. Silas finished his coffee. He stood up, dusted off his denim trousers, and looked down at her. "Break's over in 10, Silas said. "I'll be ready in 5, Josie replied. Silas' mouth twitched at the corner, almost a smile. He tipped his hat and walked back toward the herd. Josie finished her coffee. The exhaustion in her bones felt a little lighter today. Saturday morning in town. The town of Red Creek wasn't much to look at: a dusty main street, a bank, a saloon, a mercantile. But it was the center of the universe for the people who lived on the edge of nowhere. Josie drove her wagon into town to buy supplies for the week: flour, sugar, and a bottle of cough syrup for Martha's lungs. She tied the mule to the post outside the mercantile. She brushed the dust off her skirt. She hadn't worn a dress all week. It felt strange against her legs, restricting. She pushed open the heavy wooden door. The bell above it jingled. The mercantile was busy. A half-dozen women stood near the fabric counter. Mrs. Gable, the store owner's wife, was measuring out calico. When the bell rang, the conversation stopped. 6 pairs of eyes turned to Josie. The silence was thick. It was the kind of silence that had teeth. Josie kept her chin high. She walked down the aisle to the dry goods section. She could hear the whispers starting up behind her like dry leaves blowing across. I heard she practically lives at the Double H now, leaves that poor, fatherless girl home alone. They say she didn't just sell her labor to Silas Vance, if you catch my meaning. Josie's hands gripped the edge of the wooden counter, her knuckles turned white. A bullet can kill you, but gossip can bury you alive. It was the weapon of the coward. It was how society kept women in line. If you stepped outside the box they built for you, they didn't attack your work. They attacked your virtue. She took a slow, deep breath. She let go of Count Saturn. She gathered her supplies, walked to the register, and paid. She didn't look at the women. She didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her bleed. She carried her burlap sack out the door. She stepped onto the wooden boardwalk, and she stopped dead in her tracks. Standing in front of her wagon was Thaddeus Cornwall. He wore a tailored wool suit, a silk vest, a gold pocket watch chained across his chest. He smelled like expensive bay rum and cold ambition. He was smoking a thin cigar. "Mrs. Mercer," Cornwall said. His voice was smooth, like oil on a knife blade. "Mr. Cornwall," Josie said. She didn't step back. She held her burlap sack tightly. "I hear you've taken up ranch handing." Cornwall smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. A tragic fall from grace. Arthur must be spinning in his grave to see his wife playing in the mud with Silas Vance's crew. Arthur knew the value of hard work, Josie said coldly. Something a man who hires others to do his sweating wouldn't understand. Cornwall's smile faded. The mask slipped, just for a second. He took a step closer. He lowered his voice.
You think you've outsmarted me, Josephine. You think hiding behind Silas Vance's money keeps your farm safe. But Vance can't protect you from the law.
Josie frowned.
The debt is being paid. The bank has no claim.
"I'm not talking about the bank," Cornwall said softly. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his inner coat pocket. "I'm talking about the 1869 Land Settlement Act, Section 4. He tapped the paper with a manicured finger. "This territory was settled on the condition that deeds are held by a male head of household. Arthur was the head of household. Arthur is dead. You have no son. Legally, the county can seize that land, auction it off, and wipe your name from the map." The air left Josie's lungs. It was a punch she didn't see coming. An archaic law. A dusty piece of paper drafted by men who thought a woman was just another piece of property to be managed. Cornwall smiled again. "I filed the petition with the circuit judge yesterday. He's a good friend of mine. You're going to lose the farm, Josephine. And all that sweating you redoing for Silas Vance won't mean a damn thing. You should have sold to me when you had the chance." He turned to walk away. Something inside. Josie snapped, not from fear, from rage, a deep generational rage that had been boiling in the blood of pioneer women for decades. "Mr. Cornwall." Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the street noise like a gunshot. Cornwall stopped. He turned. Josie stepped off the boardwalk. She closed the distance between them. She looked up at him, her eyes blazing with a fierce, unyielding light. "You think a piece of paper makes you a man?" Josie asked. Her voice shook, but not with tears. "You think a law written by cowards gives you the right to steal what I have bled into this dirt?" Cornwall sneered. "It's the law, Mrs. Mercer. Women don't own the West. Women built the West." Josie fired back. People on the boardwalk stopped. They turned to listen. Josie didn't care. Let them hear. "We buried our children in this dirt," Josie said, her voice rising, carrying the weight of absolute truth. "We stood on porches with rifles while our husbands were away. We pulled the plows when the mules died. A society where women give birth to the men yet are denied the right to own the dirt they bleed to keep is a society rotting from the inside, Mr. Cornwall." Cornwall's face flushed dark red. He looked around. The townspeople were staring. You are making a scene, Mrs. Mercer," he hissed. "I am making a promise," Josie said. She stepped so close she could smell the stale tobacco on his breath. "You try to take my home. You try to behind a judge and a crooked law. I will fight you in the court. I will fight you in the street. I will fight you until my last breath leaves my body. Do you understand me?" Cornwall didn't answer. He couldn't. He had expected a weeping widow. He had expected her to beg. He threw his cigar into the dirt, turned on his heel, and walked quickly toward the saloon. Josie stood in the street. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She turned around. Across the street, leaning against the wooden post of the bank, was Silas Vance, and been standing there the whole time. He had heard every word. He didn't cross the street to comfort her. He didn't rush over to offer his lawyers or his money. He just stood there. He raised his hand. He touched the brim of his hat, a silent salute, a profound acknowledgement of the war she had just declared. Josie took a deep breath. She tossed her supplies into the back of her wagon. She climbed up onto the wooden bench, took the reins, and clicked her tongue. The battle lines were drawn, and she was going to need every ounce of strength she had to survive the war. The bunkhouse was quiet. It was a heavy, exhausted kind of quiet. The kind that settles over a room when 15 men have spent 14 hours fighting the earth. Most of the hands were already asleep in their bunks, snoring, shifting under wool blankets. At the far end of the long room near the cast-iron stairs sat Elias Thorne. He had a kerosene lamp turned up high. The yellow light cast long shadows against the rough pine walls. Spread out on the scarred wooden table were the Double H ranch ledgers. Elias was a man who understood dirt. He understood horses. He understood the weather just by smelling the wind. He did not understand numbers. He held a stubby lead pencil. He rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand. He muttered a curse under his breath. He scratched a line out. He wrote another one. He groaned. Across the room, sitting on a wooden crate near the door, was Josie. She was the last one awake, besides Elias. She had a stiff leather riding harness draped across her lap. She was working a rag dipped in neat S-foot oil into the cracked leather, working the stiffness out. She watched Elias. She watched the frustrations rolling off his shoulders. She put the rag down. She set the harness on the crate. She walked over to the table. Her boots made soft, rhythmic sounds on the floorboards. Elias didn't look up. Go to sleep, Josie. Dawn comes early. You've been staring at that page for an hour, Elias, Josie said quietly. You've erased a hole straight through the paper. Elias threw the pencil down. It bounced off the ledger. Numbers don't bleed, Elias grumbled, but they sure do kill a man. We shipped 300 head of steers to the railhead in Abilene last month. The broker sent the bank draft, but the tally doesn't square with the freight cost. It's off. I know it's off, but the numbers keep swimming like fish in a muddy creek. He leaned back in his chair, defeated. Let me look, Josie said. Elias scoffed. He didn't mean it to be cruel. It was just instinct. It's ranch accounting, Josie, Elias said, shaking his head. It's rail tariffs and shrinkage allowances. It's not a recipe for peach pie. You don't need to trouble your head with it. Josie didn't get angry. She didn't raise her voice. She just reached across the table and turned the heavy leather-bound book around so it faced her. Elias started to protest. He reached out to pull the book back, but he stopped, because the way Josie looked at the page wasn't the way a person looked at a foreign language. Her eyes snapped to the columns. They tracked down the rows of ink, precise, fast. The numbers didn't swim for Josie. They sang. They fell into line like well-trained soldiers. She picked up the stubby pencil. 300 head, Josie murmured, her eyes darting across the page. Average weight 1,200 pounds. You budgeted a 4% shrinkage for the drive to the railhead. Elias stared at her. Yeah, 4%. Standard. But the rail tariff, Josie said, tracing the pencil down a column. The broker charged you the freight rate for the full weight before the shrinkage, not the weight that actually went on the train. And look here, she tapped the paper. He tacked on a 2% holding fee at the stockyards, but the date on the shipping manifest shows the cattle loaded the same day they arrived. They didn't hold them. They shipped them straight through. Josie did the math in her head. It took her 3 seconds. He skimmed you, Elias. He overcharged the freight and invented a holding fee. You reshort $340. She put the pencil down. She pushed the book back to the center of the table. Elias sat frozen. He looked at the numbers she had just broken down. It was clear as day. The fog was gone. He looked up at Josie. His mouth was slightly open. Before Elias could speak, the bunkhouse door creaked open. Silas stepped inside. He had been checking the perimeter. He brushed the night chill off his coat. He looked at the table. He looked at Elias' stunned face. Then he looked at Josie. Is there a problem? Silas asked. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet room. Boss? Elias said. His voice sounded hollow, shocked. Josie just found the leak in the Abilene shipment. Silas walked over. He stood next to the table. He looked down at the ledger. She found it, Silas said. Elias said. He shook his head, still staring at the paper. She caught a freight overlap and a phantom holding fee. $340. Silas didn't look at the book. He looked at Josie. His eyes were dark, searching. Where does a farmer's wife learn to run numbers like a Chicago banker? Silas asked. Josie stood tall. She didn't shrink under his gaze. She didn't apologize for knowing what she knew. I wasn't always a farmer's wife, Josie said. Her voice was steady, rhythmic. My father was Nathaniel Hayes. He helped draft the land laws for this county. He didn't have sons. He had me, and he didn't believe a woman's brain was only good for remembering when to take the bread out of the oven. She looked down at her calloused hands, then back up at Silas. He taught me arithmetic with dried beans on the kitchen table. He taught me compound interest. He taught me how to read a contract. He fed my mind, Silas. And Arthur? Silas asked quietly. Josie's jaw tightened. A shadow passed over eyes. Arthur was a good man in his own way, Josie said. But he was a man of his time. When we got married, he took the books. He locked them in a tin box under the floorboards. He told me it wasn't women's work. He said a woman's mind was too fragile for the weight of commerce. She stepped closer to the table. The lamplight caught the fire in her eyes. It wasn't the commerce that was heavy, Josie said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. It was the cake. When you starve a mind, Silas, it doesn't just go to sleep. it eats itself. I spent 16 years pretending I didn't know how the world worked because making my husband feel big required me to make myself small. It was the most she had spoken in years. The words hung in the air, heavy, true. This was the explicit truth. A truth a lot of women lived, but very few survived intact. A society that forces half its people to hide their brilliance out of fear is a society that runs on half an engine. Elias looked down at his boots. He felt a sudden deep shame. Not for Arthur Mercer, but for himself. For assuming she couldn't understand a ledger just because she wore a skirt. Silas didn't look away. He absorbed her words. He let them settle into his bones. A lesser man would have been intimidated. A lesser man would have thanked her for her help, closed the book, and sent her back to the fence line. A lesser man needs to be the smartest person in the room to feel like he's in charge. Silas Vance was not a lesser man. He reached out and placed his hand flat on the open ledger. He closed it. He looked at Elias. "Go to bed, Elias," Silas said. Elias nodded. He stood up, grabbed his hat, and walked quietly to his bunk. Silas picked up the heavy ledger. "Come with me," he said to Josie. Josie followed him out of the bunkhouse. They walked across the dark yard. The wind had died down. The stars were sharp and bright against the black Texas sky. They walked up the steps of the main house. Silas opened the door. He led her into his office. He walked behind his massive oak desk, crouched down. Josie heard the heavy clink of iron keys. A heavy safe door opened. Silas stood up. He carried 3 more leather-bound books. They were thick, heavy, the entire financial history of the Double H Ranch. He set them down on the desk. They landed with a solid thud. He placed the current ledger on top of the stack. Then he looked at Josie. "I have 800 head of cattle," Silas said. "I have contracts with the railroad, the slaughterhouses in Chicago, and the grain suppliers in Kansas. I have men stealing from me because I am out on the dirt instead of behind this desk." He pushed the stack of books across the polished wood, toward her. "I am paying you $1.50 a day to swing an iron bar in the dirt," Silas said. His voice was completely level, stripped of all pride. "That is a waste of your time, and it is a waste of my money. Your mind is worth a lot more than your back, Josie." Josie stared at the books, her heart hammered against her ribs, not in fear. You want me to run your books?" Josie asked. "I want you to fix my books," Silas corrected. "I want you to find every penny that cattle broker stole from me. And then I want you to draft a letter to him that will make his blood run cold." Josie slowly reached out. Her calloused fingers touched the leather cover of the top ledger. It was a simple action, touching a book, but the weight of it was staggering. He wasn't giving her a chore. He was handing her the lifeblood of his empire. He was trusting her with the very thing her husband had said she was too fragile to handle. This was the implicit value of true respect. Silas didn't give her a speech about equality. He didn't offer her pity for the years she spent in the dark. He just handed her the lantern and asked her to lead the way. "I'll need a quiet place to work," Josie said. Her voice trembled, just slightly, before she locked it down tight. "You can use this desk," Silas said, "anytime I'm not using it." "And my pay?" Josie asked. She looked up at him, the businesswoman returning to the surface. Silas pulled his fountain pen from his pocket. He didn't hesitate. $2.50 a day, Silas said, "and a bonus for every dollar you recover from Abilene." Josie looked at him. Really looked at him, the hard, wealthy cowboy who had ridden into her yard to take her water. The man who had stood beside her in the dirt. The man who now stood across from her, offering her back a piece of her own soul. Healing doesn't always come with bandages. Sometimes it doesn't even come with soft words. Sometimes healing is just a man looking at you and finally, truly seeing exactly what you are capable of. "I'll start tomorrow morning," Josie said. Silas nodded. "I'll have Cookie bring a pot of coffee to the office." He walked past her. He stopped in the doorway. He looked back. "Your father," Silas said softly. "Nathaniel." "Yes?" "He built a good mind," Silas said. "I'm glad you stopped hiding it." He stepped out into the hall, leaving her alone in the office. Josie stood in the quiet room. She looked at the stack of ledgers. She placed both hands flat on the leather covers. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 16 years, Josie Mercer took a full deep breath. The cage was open, and she was ready to fly. The Texas wind howled. It battered the thick glass of the ranch house windows. It tore across the plains, wild and angry. But inside the kitchen of the Double H, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels heavy, like holding your breath. It was past midnight. Josie sat at the heavy pine table. The ledgers were closed for the night. The ink was dry. She rubbed her eyes with the heels of her hands. Her shoulders ached, but it wasn't the dull, breaking ache of the fence line. It was a good ache. The ache of a mind finally being stretched after years in a box. A floorboard creaked in the hall. Josie lowered her. Silas stood in the doorway. He wore a plain, white, cotton shirt, untucked. His suspenders hung loose by his hips. His hair was messy. He looked like a man who had been staring at the ceiling for hours. Numbers don't let you sleep either, Silas asked. His voice was rough, coated in sleep. The numbers are fine, Josie said softly. It's the quiet, it is too loud. Silas nodded. He understood that. He walked over to the cast iron stove. He didn't ask if she wanted anything. He just stirred the embers. He added a small piece of mesquite wood. He set the blue enamel coffee pot on the heat. Josie watched him, the wealthiest cattleman in the Panhandle, standing in his dark kitchen in the middle of the night, making coffee for a farm widow. There was a profound, silent respect in that action. A man raised in that era was taught to be served by women, to expect it. Silas wasn't asking her to tend the fire. He wasn't expecting her to pour his cup. He was serving her. It was an implicit acknowledgement that in this room, at this table, they were entirely equal. The water began to boil, a low rumble. Silas poured 2 tin cups. He walked over. He set one in front of Josie. He sat down across from her. The only light came from a single kerosene lantern on the table. It cast deep shadows. It half-lit his face. It half-lit hers. The contrast was sharp. Warm yellow light against the cold dark of the room. The heat wrapped her hands around the tin cup. You found the leak, Silas said. Elias told me. You drafted the letter to Abilene. I did, Josie said. He owes you $340, plus interest. He'll pay it. The math doesn't give him anywhere to hide. Silas took a slow sip of his coffee. You saved me a lot of money, Josie, but that's not why you're sitting here awake. Josie looked down at the dark liquid. She didn't answer right away. She traced the rim of the cup with her thumb. I found a box of Arthur's old shirts today, Josie said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. In the bottom of my trunk, I was looking for rags. I held one up and I realized I couldn't remember the sound of his laugh. She looked up at Silas. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, with a painful, sharp clarity. People in town think I'm grieving him, Josie said. They think I'm wearing his coat because I can't let go. I wear it because it's thick canvas and I can't afford a new one. Silas just listened. He didn't interrupt it. He didn't offer a platitude. Arthur didn't hit me, Josie said, the words spilling out now. Explicit, raw. He didn't drink. He provided. Society says I should drop to my knees and thank God for a man like that. But society doesn't see the inside of a house, Silas. It doesn't see how a woman gets worn down. Inch by inch, she leaned forward. He made all the decisions. He handled all the money. Every time I had him patted my hand and told me not to worry. Every time I asked a question, he smiled like I was a child. In that marriage, I slowly became a shadow of myself. I traded my voice for a roof, and I am terrified, Silas. I am terrified of ever depending on anyone again. I am terrified that if I lean on someone, I'll forget how to stand on my own. The words hung in the air. It was the tragic reality for thousands of women in the West. Fed and clothed, but entirely erased. Silas didn't reach across the table. He didn't try to hold her hand. He knew better. She didn't need to be touched. She needed to be heard. He looked into his coffee cup. The reflection of the lantern flickered in the dark water. Her name was Sarah, Silas said. His voice was low. Gravel and grief went still. She knew he was a widower. Everyone knew, but no one ever heard him speak her name. We got married young, Silas continued. He didn't look at Josie. He looked at a memory. I was poor, dirt poor. I promised her the world. I told her I was going to build an empire, so she wouldn't ever have to worry. I drove cattle up to Kansas. I dug wells. I fought rustlers. I spent 300 days a year in a saddle. He took a slow breath. I bought this land. I built this house. I bought the finest furniture in St. Louis and had it shipped on a train. I was so busy chasing land, I forgot the person waiting at home. I was up in Dodge City negotiating a beef contract when she caught typhoid fever. Silas finally looked up. His eyes met Josie's. They were filled with an old, jagged pain. It took her 4 days to die, Silas said. I wasn't there. I was sitting in a saloon counting money. By the time I rode back that our grave was already settled, I built her an empire, Josie, but I let her die. The silence returned, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was shared. I learned the hard way, Silas said softly. A man's greatest asset isn't what he owns, it's who he chooses to share it with. And if you don't look at the person sitting across from you, really look at them, you lose them long before they're in the ground. They sat in the quiet, 2 people carrying scars that nobody else could see, you understood? Silas wasn't a cold calculator because he didn't care. He was cold because he cared too much, and it had cost him everything. And Silas understood Josie. She wasn't fierce because she was angry. She was fierce because she had fought her way out of a cage, and she refused to go back in. They finished their coffee in silence. Silas stood up. He took her empty cup. Get some sleep, Josie, he said. You too, Silas. He turned and walked back down the dark hall. Josie watched him go. For the first time in years, the wall she had built around her chest felt a little less like a fortress, and a little more like a door. Gossip is a coward's bullet. It doesn't drop you right away. It lets you bleed. It infects the wound. It rots you from the inside out. It was a Friday afternoon. Josie was back at her farm. She was standing at the washboard on the back porch, scrubbing lye soap into a pair of overalls. She heard the gate latch click. Abby was walking up the dirt path. She was early. School didn't let out for another hour. Josie wiped her hands on her apron. She stepped off the porch. Abby's head was down. Her shoulders were shaking. When she looked up, her face was streaked with dirt and tears. Her bottom lip was bleeding. Josie, daughter. She ran to her daughter. What happened? Who hit you? Abby shook her head. She threw her arms around Josie's waist and buried her face in her mother's chest. She sobbed, deep, ragged gasps. They said awful things, Mama, Abby choked out. Josie felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands tightened on Abby's shoulders. Who, what things? Billy Cornwall, Abby cried. And the Miller girls, they said you don't really work at the Double H. They said you just pretend to work, so Silas Vance will pay our debts. They said you sold yourself to him, and that I'm dirty just by living in the same house. Josie stopped breathing. The wind blew across the dry yard, kicking up dust. Abby looked up, her eyes wide and pleading. I hit Billy. I hit him in the mouth. Then the teacher pulled me off and sent me home. She said I was acting like a wild animal. Mama, tell me it's not true. Tell me you just work the books. Josie felt a physical pain in her chest, her ribs. This was Cornwall's against work. If it couldn't break her in the street. So he whispered in the dark. He let the poison trickle down to the children. He was using her daughter's shame as leverage. Look at my hands, Abby, Josie said. She held up her scarred, calloused palms. Her voice was shaking with rage. Do these look like the hands of a woman who doesn't work? Abby cried harder and hugged her again. Josie held her daughter tightly, but her eyes looked out across the dead wheat closing in. A shadow fell over the dirt path. Josie looked up. Deputy Miller was walking toward the house. He didn't look happy. He held a folded white paper in his hand. Josie gently pushed Abby toward the door. Go inside. Wash your face. Put the kettle on for your grandmother. Abby wiped her nose and ran inside. Josie turned to face the deputy. She stood tall. She didn't wipe the soap suds off her arms. Afternoon, Josie, Deputy Miller said. He wouldn't meet her eyes. What is it, Tom? Miller held out the paper. Court summons, signed by Judge Holden. Thaddeus Cornwall filed a petition to seize the deed. Based on the 1869 Head of Household Act, you have to appear in county court. If you don't show, they auction the farm on Tuesday. Josie took the paper. The paper felt heavy, like a tombstone. Tom, Josie said, her voice dead flat. You know Arthur bought this land fair. You know I run it. I know, Josie. Miller tipped his hat, looking miserable. But I just served the papers. The law is the law. He turned and walked away quickly. He didn't want to look at her. He didn't want to see a woman standing on the gallows he had just built. Josie stood alone on the porch, the paper in her hand, the echoes of Abby's tears in her ears. The pressure was too much. The walls of the cage were slamming shut. Cornwall had outflanked her. If she fought the law, she would likely lose. The judge was bought. The town was whispering. If she turned to Silas for help, if she let him hire her a lawyer with his money, the town would be right. She would just be a woman being saved by a rich man. She would be trading her independence for protection. She would be exactly what she promised herself she would never be again. Josie walked into the barn. She threw a saddle on her horse. She pulled the cinch tight, violent, frantic. She rode to the Double H at a dead gallop. She didn't tie the horse. She dropped the reins in the yard and ran up the steps to the main house. She pushed the door open. Silas was sitting at his desk. He looked up, surprised by the loud bang of the door. Josie marched into the office. She reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out the labor contract they had signed. The contract that saved her farm. She slammed it onto his desk. Then she tore it in half. Silas slowly stood up. He didn't yell. He looked at the torn paper. Then he looked at her pale, desperate face. Josie, Silas said gently. What happened? The deal is off, Josie said. Her voice was breathless, shaking. I'm done. I'm not doing the books. I'm not fixing your fences. I am done. Silas frowned. Did Elias do something? Did one of the men say something to you? The whole town is saying something, Josie yelled. The dam finally broke. They're calling me a whore, Silas. They're telling my 14-year-old daughter that her mother is selling herself to the cattle baron to keep a roof over her head. Silas' eyes went dark. His jaw locked. Give me names. I'll ride into town right now. No, Josie slammed her hands on the desk. Don't you see? If you ride into town, if you threaten them, you prove them right. You prove that I need you to fight my battles. She threw the court summons onto the desk next to the torn contract. Cornwall got the judge, Josie said, her voice cracking. I have court on Monday. I'm going to lose the farm, Silas. I'm going to lose everything. Silas looked at the summons. He looked at the torn contract. Josie, Silas said, his voice steady, trying to anchor her. I have 3 lawyers in Abilene. They will bury Cornwall in paperwork. He won't touch your land. I will pay for it. All of it. It was the instinct of a protector. He wanted to solve the problem. He had the money to make the monster go away. No. Josie stepped back. She shook her head. No, I won't take your money. It's not charity, Silas pleaded. It's strategy. It's suicide, Josie shouted. Tears finally spilled over her eyelashes, hot and angry. If you save me, Silas, then I am exactly what they say I am. I am just a weak, helpless widow who had to find a rich man to survive. I spent 16 years being invisible. I will not disappear again, even if it means I lose the farm, even if it means we sleep in the dirt. I have to fight this myself. She looked at him, begging him to understand. If I let you save me, she whispered, I lose my... Silas stood behind the desk. The silence in the room was deafening. He could fix this. He could force her to take the help. He could buy the judge. He could ruin Cornwall by sunset. But Silas Vance truly looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, not the terror of losing land, the terror of losing her agency, the terror of the cage. Implicit value of respect. Silas realized that true respect meant letting her have the right to fail. It meant acknowledging that her pride and her autonomy were more important than his desire to play the hero. Loving someone doesn't mean fighting their war. It means holding the line while they fight their own. Silas slowly lowered his hands. He stepped back from the desk. He didn't argue. He didn't push. All right, Silas said. His voice was thick with emotion, but absolutely firm. The contract is void. You fight him your way. Josie let out a ragged breath. She nodded once. She turned and walked out of the office. She walked out the door and rode away. Silas stood alone in the office. He looked at the torn contract on his desk. He had just let the only woman he had ever truly respected ride into a slaughterhouse alone. But he knew, in his gut, it was the only way she would ever survive. Sunday night, the farmhouse was quiet, the kind of quiet that rings in your ears. Outside, the wind rattled the dry corn stalks. Inside, the grandfather clock ticked. Every second was hammer swinging closer to Monday morning. Josie sat at the kitchen table. The kerosene lamp burned low. She stared at her hands. They were calloused, scarred. They had pulled calves from the mud. They had swung iron in the unforgiving Texas sun. But tomorrow, a judge in a clean black robe was going to look at these hands and declare them legally empty. She had fought. Lord knew she had fought. But a woman fighting the law in 1878 was like fighting a prairie fire with a bucket of spit. A floorboard creaked. Josie looked up. Abby stood in the doorway. She wore her cotton nightgown. Her feet, she was holding a flat, rusted tin box. You should be asleep, Abby, Josie said softly. Abby didn't move toward the bed. She walked to the table. She set the tin box down in the pool of yellow light. Grandma Martha told me to get this, Abby said. From under the floorboards in your room, she said. Arthur put it there, but she said it doesn't belong to Arthur. It belongs to you. Josie frowned. She reached out and popped the rusted latch. The lid creaked open. Inside was a stack of papers, old. Yellowed at the edges, they were her father's paper. Nathaniel Hayes. Drafts of the county charters, land surveys, letters of incorporation for the town of Red Creek. Arthur had locked them away the week they got married. He said looking at the past wouldn't plow the fields. Josie's fingers brushed the dry parchment. Grandma said Grandpa Hayes was a smart man, Abby whispered. She said he wouldn't have built a town that would steal from his own daughter. Josie looked at Abby. The implicit truth hung in the air. The women in this house are fighting for you, even when you think you are alone. Josie pulled the papers out. She began to read. She read for an hour. Then, too, the legal language came back to her. The sharp, precise math of the law. At the bottom of the stack, folded neatly, was a heavy sheet of vellum. The original draft of the 1858 Red Creek Settlement Charter. The one her father had forced the state legislature to sign before he would survey the county. Josie's eyes scanned the faded ink. They stopped at section 4, paragraph 2. She read the words. Once, twice. Her breath hitched. A slow, hot fire ignited in her chest. It burned away the exhaustion. It burned away the fear. She looked up at the dark window. She wasn't a helpless widow anymore. She was Nathaniel Hayes' daughter, and she was armed. Monday morning. Red Creek. Thaddeus Cornwall sat beside the Oscany desk. He was drinking tea from a china cup. His lawyer, a slick man named Vance, sat on the leather sofa. The clock on the wall read 9 o'clock. Court convened at 10. The heavy oak door to the office didn't knock. It swung open, hard. Josie walked in. She wasn't wearing her morning dress. She was wearing her canvas work coat. Her leather boots hit the polished hardwood floor. With a heavy, rhythmic thud, Cornwall paused with his teacup halfway to his mouth. He smiled, a thin, victorious smile. Mrs. Mercer, Cornwall said smoothly, I suppose you've come to hand over the deed. It is the smart thing to do, saves us all the embarrassment of a public eviction. Josie didn't speak. She walked straight to his desk. She pulled a folded piece of heavy vellum from her coat pocket. She dropped it on the mahogany wood. It landed with a soft, definitive smack. I came to give you a history lesson, Mr. Cornwall, Josie said. Cornwall frowned. He glanced at his lawyer. Then he looked down at the paper. "What is this?" "That is the 1858 Red Creek Settlement Charter," Josie said. Her voice was steady. It didn't shake. "Drafted by Nathaniel Hayes, my father. Signed by the governor of Texas." Cornwall let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Arthur's name is on the deed, Josephine. The 1869 statute requires a male head of household. You have no legal standing. Read Section 4. Paragraph 2, Josie commanded. Cornwall glared at her, but he picked up the paper. His eyes tracked across the faded ink. As he read, the color slowly drained from his face. Josie didn't wait for him to finish. She recited it from memory, explicit, unforgiving. "In recognition of the equal peril faced by all pioneers, land inheritance rights within this county shall not be infringed, altered, or denied upon the basis of the title holder's sex. A widow holds the exact and total legal authority of her late husband." The lawyer stood up from the sofa. He looked nervous. Cornwall dropped the paper. "This is an archaic draft. The 1869 statute supersedes it." "No, it doesn't," Josie fired back. "The 1858 charter is foundational. It's the legal bedrock of this county. If you invalidate this charter, you invalidate every single property line in Red Creek, including yours." She leaned over the desk. She looked it dead in the eye. "You take me to court today, Mr. Cornwall. You put that piece of paper in front of the judge. If he rules against me, he sets a precedent that destroys the deed to your own 8,000 acres. Are you willing to lose your empire just to steal my water?" Cornwall stared at her. His jaw tightened. The silence in the room was absolute. He tried to use the law as a club. He didn't expect her to have a sharper sword. "You withdraw the petition," Josie said, her voice low and hard. "You drop the suit, and you never look at my land again. Or I walk across the street, hand this paper to the judge, and watch your empire burn." Cornwall swallowed. His eyes darted to his lawyer. The lawyer gave a grim, microscopic nod. The law was airtight. Cornwall slowly sat back in his chair. He looked at Josie. "Not as a victim, as a conqueror, Mrs. Mercer," Cornwall whispered. "I am a free woman," Josie corrected. "Try to remember the difference." She picked up the vellum charter. She folded it. She put it back in her pocket. She turned on her heel and walked outdoor, the door high noon. The Double H Ranch. Silas was in the corral. He had a heavy brush in his hand. He was grooming his black stallion. He scrubbed the brush against the horse's coat, hard angry. He hadn't slept. He had spent the entire weekend staring at the wall. He had let her ride away. He had honored her independence, but it tasted like ash in his mouth. He heard the rhythmic crunch of boots on the gravel. Silas stopped brushing. He turned around. Josie stood by the wooden fence. She looked exhausted. There was dust on her coat, but her shoulders were pulled back. Her chin was up. The heavy, suffocating weight she had carried for 2 years was gone. Silas dropped the brush. He walked to the fence. He looked at her face. He didn't ask what happened. He could see it in her eyes. "He dropped the suit," Josie said quietly. "Cornwall is done." Silas let out a breath he'd been holding 3 days. He gripped the top rail of the wooden fence. "You beat him," Silas said. The pride in his voice was thick. "Real, I did," Josie said. She stepped closer to the fence. Only the wooden rail separated them. "I was terrified," Silas, Josie said, looking up at him. "I was terrified that if I didn't let you save me, I would lose everything. But I needed to know that I could stand on my own 2 feet. I needed to know that the cage was really gone." Silas nodded. "I know. That's why I let you go." Josie reached out. She placed her calloused hand over his on the wooden rail. "I told you I was afraid of leaning on someone," Josie said. Her voice was steady, clear, and ringing with explicit truth. "I was afraid of needing a man to survive, but I don't need you to save my farm, Silas. My farm is safe. I don't need your money. I can make my own." Silas looked down at her hand, covering his. Then he looked into her eyes. "Then why are you here, Josie?" he asked softly. "Because I don't need you," Josie smiled. The first true radiant smile he had ever seen on her face. "But I choose you. I want to be your partner, in the ledgers, in the dirt, and in this life, as an equal." Silas didn't grab her. He didn't pull her over the fence. He turned his hand over under hers. He laced his fingers through hers. Palm to palm, callus to callus, an invitation, accepted. "I choose you, Josie," Silas said. "Every day, until the dirt takes us." They stood by the fence in the Texas sun, 2 people who had fought their way through the dark, finally standing in the light. Together, the Double H office was bathed in the warm, golden light of late afternoon. Josie sat on the leather sofa. Silas sat behind his desk. Between them stood Elias Thorne, turning his hat in his hands. Elias cleared his throat. He looked at the floorboards. "I got something to confess, boss," Elias said. "Been eating at me for months." Silas leaned back in his chair. "Go on, Elias." "That first day," Elias muttered, "the day you went to the cattleman's bank, the day you bought Arthur Mercer's debt." Josie sat forward. She looked at the old foreman. "It wasn't a coincidence," Elias said, finally looking up. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a worn, folded piece of paper. He handed it to Josie. Josie took the paper. She unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, frail, but she recognized it instantly. It was Martha handwriting, her mother-in-law. Josie read the words, "To Mr. Silas Vance. I am an old woman and I do not have much time. My daughter-in-law is carrying a weight that will kill her. She will never ask for help. She is too proud. Cornwall is circling like a vulture. I beg of you as a man of conscience, buy the debt. Give her a chance to work it off. Do not let her drown in the dirt she loves." Josie stared at the letter, her eyes blurred with tears, implicit value. The wicked mother-in-law was a myth built by society to keep women divided. Martha had seen her. Martha had loved her. The old woman had swallowed the pride of the Mercer name, secretly reaching out to a stranger just to give Josie a fighting chance. Josie looked up at Silas. "You knew?" "I didn't know you," Silas said gently. "But a woman who writes a letter like that, I figured whoever she was trying to protect was worth looking into." Josie folded the letter. She held it against her chest. Elias tipped his hat. "Just thought you ought to know, Josie. You weren't fighting alone. Not completely." He turned and quietly left the office, shutting the heavy door behind him. Silas opened the center drawer of his desk. He reached inside. He pulled out the original bank deed, the paper that held the remaining debt on the Mercer farm. He set it on the desk. Then he picked it up. He gripped it with both hands, and he tore it straight down the middle. Josie stood up. "Silas, what are you doing? I still owe you $400 in labor." Silas threw the torn pieces into the iron trash bin beside his desk. "No, you don't," Silas said. "The debt is paid. Your mind paid it off 10 times over when you fixed the Abilene accounts. The farm is yours, free and clear." He reached into his drawer again. He pulled out a fresh blank sheet of white paper. He pulled out his fountain pen. He slid the blank paper and the pen across the polished wood, stopping at the desk right in front of Josie. "What is this?" Josie asked. Silas stood up. He looked at her with an intensity that took her breath away. "I tore up the old contract, Josie," Silas said. His voice was a rhythmic, steady cadence, full of explicit, undeniable truth. "Now you write the terms of our life, you write the rules. Whatever you need to feel safe, whatever you need to stay free, you write it down, and I will sign it." Josie looked at the blank paper. This was the ultimate surrender. Not a surrender of weakness, but a surrender of power. A wealthy, powerful man in the 1800s handing a woman a blank page and telling her to dictate her own freedom. Josie picked up the pen. Her hand didn't shake. She leaned over the desk. She didn't write legal jargon. She wrote from the heart. 1. The Mercer farm remains in my name forever. 2. My voice is heard before any major decisions are made for our family or our land. 3. Neither of us must ever surrender who we are for the comfort of the other. She finished. She turned the paper around and slid it back to Silas. Silas didn't even read it. He picked up the pen. He signed his name at the bottom in bold black ink. He looked up at her. "Is there a fourth clause?" "Yes." Josie smiled, a tear finally slipping down her cheek. "You make the coffee at midnight." Silas smiled, a real wide smile. He reached across the desk, took her calloused hand, and pulled her to him. They didn't have a grand wedding. There was no white lace, no church bells. They stood under the giant oak tree in the front yard of the Mercer farm. The autumn leaves were turning gold. The Texas wind was gentle for once. Abby stood beside her mother, beaming. Elias stood beside Silas. Martha sat in a wooden chair, wrapped in a quilt, watching the two people she loved most save each other. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Silas didn't dip Josie backward. He didn't claim her. He took her face in his rough hands, leaned in, and kissed her with a quiet, fierce reverence. They belonged to each other because they both owned themselves. 4 years later, 1882, the Texas sun set over the plains, painting the sky in strokes of bruised purple and violent orange. Josie Vance sat on the front porch of the Double H Ranch. She was 42 years old. There were a few silver streaks in her dark hair. Her hands were still calloused. She held a heavy leather folder in her lap. Inside were the minutes from the county agricultural board meeting. She was the first woman ever elected to the board. She hadn't asked for the seat. Elias Thorne and 6 other ranchers had written her name on the ballot. They knew who really ran the numbers in the Panhandle. Abby was gone. She was living in Abilene, attending the new teachers' college. Silas had paid the tuition, but he hadn't done it secretly. He had sat down at the kitchen table, presented the numbers to Josie, and they had signed the bank draft together. Martha had passed away 2 winters ago. She died in her sleep in a warm bed, knowing her family was safe. The screen door creaked open. Silas stepped out onto the porch. He was 48. The gray in his beard made him look distinguished. He carried 2 tin cups of steaming coffee. He handed one to Josie. He sat down in the wooden rocking chair beside her. They didn't speak for a long time. They just watched the cattle graze in the distance. The Double H herd and the Mercer crops fed each other in perfect synergy. 2 empires, standing side by side, neither swallowing the other. Josie took a sip of the bitter coffee. She leaned her head back against the wood. They say the West was built on the guns and blood of men, Josie thought, watching the stars begin to prick through the fading daylight. But that's a lie told in dime novels. The West was kept by the endurance and the minds of women. We wear the dirt. She looked over at Silas. He was watching the horizon, eyeing his profile sharp and light. He felt her eyes on him. He turned his head and smiled softly. Silas came to my farm to claim a financial debt, Josie mused. But he ended up paying me the one debt this world owes to every woman born into it: respect. There is no true freedom without equality. You cannot love someone you look down on. You can only pity them or control them. True love is a level gaze. It is standing shoulder to shoulder in the mud, pulling the same weight. Silas reached over. He laced his fingers through hers. The Texas dirt never apologized, but it didn't need to. Because for Josie and Silas Vance, the dirt wasn't a grave anymore. It was a foundation. The opinions, actions, and decisions expressed by the characters in this story do not reflect the views or beliefs of the author. Certain scenes may contain dramatic situations, emotional conflict, or morally complex behavior intended solely to serve the fictional storyline and enhance the audience viewing experience.
And there they are, on a porch in the Texas evening, side by side in their rocking chairs, watching a horizon that belongs to both of them equally. Not because the law finally said it could, but because two stubborn, scarred, extraordinary people decided it would. The Texas dirt never apologized. That is the first sentence of this story. And it is also, perhaps, its deepest truth. Because this is a story about people who stopped waiting for an apology from the world. People who stopped waiting to be seen, to be given, to be rescued, and instead planted their boots in the hard ground and decided to build. Josie Mercer arrived in this story with cracked knuckles, dead crops, a banknote she couldn't pay, and a rage so clean and righteous it could have split stone. She had spent 16 years being made smaller, not through cruelty, that is the insidious part, but through the slow daily erosion of being told that her mind was too fragile for commerce, her voice too small for the room, her hands only good for the gentle things. And what this story asks us to understand is that a cage does not have to be made of iron to be real. It only needs 4 walls made of expectation. And Josie had been living inside one, faithfully, dutifully, invisibly, for most of her adult life. The moment she picked up that iron wrench and stood in her own yard, daring the world to cross the line, that was not the beginning of her strength. That strength had always been there. That was simply the first morning she decided to stop apologizing for it. And Silas, this hard, grieving, ledger-keeping man who rode out to take her water and came home empty-handed because something in him recognized, before his mind could even form the words, that you do not collect a debt from a woman who has already paid for her life in blood and bone. Silas teaches us that the most powerful thing a person of privilege can do is not to rescue. It is to step to the other side of the broken wheel, wait for the other person to lift first, and match their rhythm. He didn't save her. He partnered with her. And the distinction between those two things is the entire moral spine of this story. Because here is the truth this story has been building toward. Through every post hole dug, and every ledger corrected, and every courtroom battle fought alone. You cannot love someone you look down upon. You can pity them. You can protect them. You can dress your control up in the language of devotion and call it care. But love, real love, is a level gaze. It is two people standing in the same mud, pulling the same weight, with neither one needing the other to be smaller so they can feel tall. Josie did not need Silas to save her farm. Her father's charter saved her farm. Her own brilliant, law-forged mind saved her farm. What she chose Silas for was partnership. And the difference between need and choice, that is where human dignity lives. That is where freedom actually begins. Not when the cage is opened for you, but when you walk out of it on your own 2 feet, turn back, and choose to let someone in because you want them there, not because you cannot survive without them. Martha, too, deserves her moment in this outro, the old woman with lungs full of fluid who reached out in secret to a stranger because she loved her daughter-in-law too much to watch her drown in pride. She reminds us that the people who quietly hold us up are often the ones we least expect, that love does not announce itself. Sometimes it just slips a letter under a door in the dark and trusts that someone decent enough to act on it will find it. And Abby, that fierce 14-year-old who hit Billy Cornwall in the mouth for insulting her mother, who grew up to go to teacher's college on a bank draft that her mother and stepfather signed together at the kitchen table, she is the harvest. She is what happens when the generation before you refuses to disappear. She will go out into the world knowing, in her bones, that her intelligence is not a courtesy extended to her by men. It is her inheritance, her birthright, her foundation. The West was not built on the guns and blood of men alone. It was kept, held together, made livable, made worth fighting for, by the endurance and the minds of women, by the Josies and the Maddies and the Claras and the Joes who buried their dead, pulled the plows, balanced the books in secret, and somehow still had enough left over to build a future. The dirt never apologized. But in the end, it didn't need to. Because Josie Vance didn't need an apology from the ground beneath her feet. She needed what every human being on this earth deserves, the right to stand on it and be exactly, fully, completely who she is. That right was never given to her. She claimed it herself. And that, perhaps, is the only way it ever truly counts.